afternoon. And I'm going to, can you hear me with this? Is it too loud? Is it about right? It's okay? Okay. I really appreciate everybody coming. And it's a great crowd, and I know it's a Saturday afternoon, and you took of your time to come. And I'm going to try to show you a few things here without boring you. Now, I know that it's going to be hard because Ben has already told me the last time was really boring. And so anyway, I'm going to try to make this somewhat interesting and hopefully tie it into your family, my family, of course, and I hope also that you get out of this some historical perspective about our history in Estill County, the history of our nation, the freedom of religion that we have today, the liberties that we have, the freedom of speech, all those things. I hope we learn from this today. And so, you know, I'll introduce myself. I think everybody here knows me. I know all of you all, but I am Sam Miller. This is going to be on Facebook Live. So, you know, I started writing this book about 14 years ago. Okay, so I'm 53. So if I do that again, I ain't got about a book and a half left in probably. But anyway, I'm going to try to make Lord's will on the next one to be a little sooner. But this is James Elkins from Leatherwood to Lovogrud, and the Leatherwood comes from not the Leatherwood in Perry County, but the Leatherwood in Southern Virginia, in what is today Henry County, Virginia. And Lovogrud comes from, of course, Lovogrud Creek that comes in the Red River there, where the Clark, Powell, and Estill all meet. And so this is my presentation about it. I'm going to give you an overview, a behind-the-scenes look, research, the documentation. Ben laid all my documentation out on this table, and I just wanted you to see it. You know, there's a lot of documentation goes into this book, and one thing I tried, and one reason it took me so long, is I tried to be factual. I wanted to be accurate. I'm not saying there's no inaccuracies in the book. There probably is, but you know, I tried to make it as factual as I could. In fact, you know, fact is greater than speculation. If there's any point in the book that I don't know, then and I speculated, then the language will say so. It will say likely or probably. You know, otherwise I give the documentation for the book. Talk a little about the type of records, the sources where I got them from. You know, the book layout. The book is large, fairly large print. It's 8.5 by 11 in size. It's arranged chronologically. You know, seemed to be the natural way to lay it out, following through the years. It's large size. It's full color. I want to showcase the documents that are in it. There's a lot of historical documents in it, and to me, that just brought the history alive. And I will say that the book is focused on 3 generations. James Elkins, who was a Revolutionary War soldier, his wife Martha Jackson, their 12 children, and then they had over 70 grandchildren. So those 3 generations is the primary focus of the book. I will tell you that I carried that on down just a little bit with my own ancestors, but I wanted to be able to tie in a lot of the oral history and show people where that had come from. Come on in.
You got a full house.
A full house, yeah. We got more chairs. Motivation for writing the book. Kind of mentioned this already. I wanted to weave family history into the larger national picture, you know. And this could probably be done for anybody's family here. That your family, your ancestors have participated in probably the Civil War, in the Revolutionary War, in all these great milestones within our nation's history. Our people have certainly took part in that. And to me that's interesting when, you know, Benjamin has learned a lot right now in 5th grade in history, American history. But when you can tie that into your own family, to me it makes it come more alive. Now, some people who know me well may say, well, why the Elkins family? You know, you have to go many generations back to even find the name Elkins in our family. And so a lot of times people don't even know we're related to the Elkins family. But as I've said before, if you know, on the Miller line, which I have researched, a lot. When you get back to James Miller, who was living in the 1700s in Pennsylvania, there's 500 James Millers, okay? And I can't tell them apart, okay? And so I can't write a book about things, that I can't differentiate one James Miller from another. But the name Elkins was one that is not that common, and one that had a lot of history with it, a lot of Revolutionary War pensions and a lot of Civil War type pensions and stuff like that. So that's one reason I chose the Elkins family. And the cover of the book, the back cover, many of you have the book today. But I want to start out in 1657, okay? And I'll try to do this in about 45 minutes. So 1657 to 2024, that's a lot of cover in 45 minutes. But in colonial Virginia, what you find out in the 1600s, most of the people that were coming to colonial Virginia were of English origin. It was before the Irish started coming. It was before the Germans started coming. It was mostly English people in the early 1600s. And the first record that I have found of Elkins in colonial Virginia was this record from 1657. This gentleman had a grant from the colony of Virginia for 350 acres, and he got that for transporting 7 indentured servants from England to the colonies. They had set up a headright system. They needed laborers in the colony, and they needed people to raise the tobacco and raise the other crops and stuff like that. So they incentivized it by offering you 50 acres for every person that you brought across the ocean. And that was an expensive trip. It was expensive to get on a ship and go across the Atlantic Ocean. And so you can see there Ralph Elkins' name at the bottom. He was one of the people that was brought over as an indentured servant. Okay, so what's going on in England that caused that? There's a type of the way you inherited a estate in England at that time was called primogeniture. And that meant that the oldest son inherited the father's estate. And that was in place because if you had 10 children, if you had 1,000 acres and you divided that up amongst 10 children, soon you'd have 100 acres. The next generation divided up, you'd have 10. And that's not what they wanted. They wanted to maintain those larger estates. And so if you were the second son, you were just kind of out of luck, okay? And so it was a lot of those second and third sons that left England and immigrated to the colony because they had an opportunity to own land. They had an opportunity to come over and establish a better life for themselves. And so that's more than likely what Ralph Elkins had done, and he was here prior to 1657. This is his actual last will and testament. And, we talk a lot today about young people not learning cursive writing, okay? I'm glad I know cursive writing, but I want you to look at that from the 1600s. And that script is really hard to read, okay? And you can take it word by word and eventually figure it out. But this is his will from 1690. I was amazed when I went to Virginia to research this that it was still there, because so many of the Virginia records were burned during the Civil War. Many of the courthouses were destroyed. But the Stafford County Courthouse had not been. Actually, what had happened was the county clerk in the Civil War had took all of the local records and hid them in a cellar. And so when they did burn the courthouse, the records actually survived. But Ralph Elkins named his sons and a daughter in this last will and testament from 1690, the oldest son being Richard Elkins. Now, Richard had a son named Ralph Elkins, named after his grandfather. And this is a lease from 1733 in Prince William County, Virginia. And in 1733, there was, actually in the 1700s, there was a type of lease called a 3 lives lease. So if you lease land from a wealthy landowner, then they typically named in your lease you, your wife, and your oldest living child. And so in this lease, if you were to read it, from 1733, George Mason III was leasing 150 acres to Ralph Elkins, his wife Frances, and their son Nathaniel. Okay? And all that's key in order to be able to trace from one generation to the next. But George Mason III owned this land on the Potomac River. And George Mason III had a son named George Mason IV. You know, you could guess that, right? But George Mason IV was very responsible for the Bill of Rights. He's considered a founding father of the United States of America. And so our family rented land from him. And in fact, George Mason IV actually sold part of this land later to his neighbor, who happened to be George Washington. And so, you know, the Elkins were living in that same neighborhood as those very famous people. Following on, tithables, that may not be a word we use much today, but we've all heard about tithing for church. And that's what this was getting to. In colonial Virginia, the official state religion was the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Today, maybe sometimes called the Episcopalian Church. And so, if you held office in the colony of Virginia, you had to be a member of the Anglican Church. And every landowner had to pay a tithe that helped support the local church, pay the salary of the clergy. And so this is like a tax list kind of. And this tithables from 1744, you'll see there it lists Ralph Elkin, Richard Elkin, and Nathaniel Elkin. So that's part of that paper trail that I used to document this family. That Nathaniel Elkin, that had been in that lease in 1733, was likely only a child. But that was common in that day. You wanted the lease in that youngest person's name, because if they lived to be 75 years old, then you had the right to lease that land for that person's lifetime. And so you wanted to put the young people on the lease. Carry that forward to 1773, Fincastle County, Virginia, and you'll see Richard Elkins listed there. And there again, you know, he was paying his taxes that was going toward the Anglican Church. Now, this map is from 1751. This is actually drawn by a man named Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson. And Peter Jefferson was the father of Thomas Jefferson. And so this is a map of kind of the southern part of Virginia. You can see a line, a fake line there is the line between Virginia and North Carolina. But those red numbers, I was able through those tax records and tithable records to trace the Elkins family as they migrated across the Virginia frontier. And so, number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you can see there from year to year how they kept moving. And the ideal is, you know, I guess the grass was always greener on the other side. They had a farm here, maybe they were renting, leasing, whatever, and then more land was opening up further west. It sounded better. It sounded like the promised land, and so they would pick up and move. And you see that going on throughout the colonial era, where people were moving across the landscape. Now, religion. The Elkins family. As I mentioned before, the older generations were probably members of the Anglican Church. But in 1755, there was a man named Shule Stearns. He was from New England, and he had went south with 16 people to start what was the first what you call a separate Baptist church in the South. Okay, and that was in 1755. He originally was going to settle in Virginia, and he ended up going to North Carolina, just across the line from Virginia. But in 1755, he established the Sandy Creek Separate Baptist Church was established, constituted with 16 members. 2 years later, it had over 600 members. What you found was that the Anglican Church in colonial Virginia, it was very structured, very organized, and so your ministers were very educated, and on the frontier, you didn't have a lot of those type of churches. You didn't have a lot of educated people that would have been in those communities. So a lot of people didn't have a church. And so when this church was established, it was maybe the only one in the community. And the separate Baptists, that terminology, the reason it came about was that they were a little different kind of Baptist than what was considered the regular Baptist. Okay, so you'll see that term in colonial Virginia, regular Baptist, which was kind of the mainstream Baptist, and then these people came along and they were separate Baptists. Okay, they were a little different. Okay, if you've ever been around Baptists, I'm a Baptist, right? But there's Baptist churches everywhere. It's not always because they're multiplying. Sometimes it's because they're dividing, right? But so what you found was that revival that broke out in northern North Carolina, southern Virginia, the Elkins family was present for that. And so what we find here, when you look at this record, if you look toward the bottom, you'll find that a church was established at Dan River, which was just across the North Carolina border into Virginia, in 1759. And Dutton Lane was the preacher, and one of his assistant ministers was Richard Elkins. And so that's when the Elkins family went from being Anglican to becoming a Baptist, okay? And they were charter members of the church. Now, the most interesting thing about this to me, now, y'all, most of you know I'm a Baptist preacher, okay? And maybe that's one reason why I like the Baptist history, okay? Is that if you look on that second page toward the bottom, and I'll read this, but there was persecution in Virginia. The Anglican church was the official church, and Baptists were considered dissenters. They were nonconformists, okay? And they actually had to get a license from the court to be able to even hold a service or preach. And many times the Anglican church did not want to give them that authority or license. And so Richard Elkins was preaching at a church there in Southern Virginia. And the last part of that second page, it says, James Roberts was going to Colonel Gordon for a warrant in 1769 against Richard Elkins. He was going to have Richard Elkins arrested for preaching. Okay, this is before the freedom of religion that we think of in our country today. And so as Roberts and another were traveling for the warrant, in the night, a strong glare of light shone about them, insomuch that the horses squatted on the ground, and was succeeded by such thick darkness that they could not see anything. Roberts concluded it was a warning for him, and henceforth ceased to be an opposer. Okay, so it's almost like the Saul on the road to Damascus. He saw a light, didn't he? And what you have here, the person who's writing this is their handwritten account of an early Baptist history from the early 1770s. This man was a Baptist minister. He was named Morgan Edwards. He was hired by the Philadelphia Baptist Association to go into the South and write a history of the Baptist church in the South. And so this is his handwritten notes from where he visited the Dan River Church in the early 1770s. And he's writing this firsthand from where he has talked to that congregation. And I traveled to Louisville to get this record. It's in the Theological Seminary at the Southern Theological Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. Excuse me. Now, going on into the land, this is from the Library of Virginia. This is actual land documents. You were allowed to take up 400 acres of land in colonial Virginia if you could prove that you had raised a crop of corn. Okay, so what's going on is that the English had encouraged a lot of Scotch-Irish immigrants to settle on the frontier. Okay, and that was a strategic move for the English. Okay, because they were putting a buffer between them and the Native Americans. Okay, the English used the Scotch-Irish in a sense, and I'm just in for both, so I can talk about them, right? But they used the Scotch-Irish as a buffer, and in that way, the Scotch-Irish were the ones who were probably, having conflicts with the Native Americans instead of the English. But this land that they offered them for settling there, they could get 400 acres just for raising a crop of corn. And so this document is from 1781. It proves James Elkins' right to 400 acres. It lists Where it's at, it's on the Clinch River, at the fork of Indian Creek, and so what you find is that you can go to this very spot today. Those creek names have not changed, and you can go to the little community called Cedar Bluff, Virginia, and that's where this land is located. This is his survey on the right. There's on 200-acre survey at that time, but he had right to 400 if you want to take it up. And you can see that it joined his dad's land, Richard Elkins. Now, going into the Revolutionary War, this is a payroll of James Elkins' company that was at the Battle of Kings Mountain. Okay, the Revolutionary War had not been going good for the Patriots. Okay, we were losing a lot of the battles in the Northeast. And so what happened was England decided to open up a front on the southern colonies. And their idea was that if they lost the northern colonies, that maybe they could hold on to the southern colonies. And so Cornwallis had invaded South Carolina and was traveling up through South Carolina going toward Virginia. They made a threat against the over mountain men, that the settlers on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, in what is today eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, western Virginia, eastern Kentucky. And so he made a mistake in threatening those over the mountain men, okay? And they were Scotch-Irish, they were English, they had been in Civil War for generations, they were used to fighting, okay? And so whenever he made that threat, whenever the British Army made that threat to them, they gathered up about 1,200 men. And they marched across the Appalachian Mountains and went after Patrick Ferguson. He was someone who was leading part of the British Army. And they caught up with him at Kings Mountain, South Carolina. Okay? And they surrounded his camp in the night, and they attacked it the next morning. And the ragtag militia from the mountains beat a very organized and well-trained British army. And it was actually one of the turning points in the Revolutionary War. After that, Cornwallis was on the defensive, trying to flee from this force that had just defeated part of his army. You can see there James Elkins is mentioned down toward the bottom. And if you'll notice, he was a footman, and some of the other people are a horseman. The only difference was he didn't have a horse, okay? So when he was going to this, he was walking, okay? And I'll show you a map here in a second. But if you look at his lieutenant at the top, Lieutenant Reese Bowen was actually killed at this battle. He lost his life. When you read James Elkins' pension, what you find is that he got to the battle as it was over. Okay, and I never did understand that until I read a book about the Battle of Kings Mountain. And what it was, they were trying to trap the British on top of that mountain as they camped. And so in the night, they sent every man that had a horse forward to try to engage the British before they broke camp. James Elkins didn't have a horse, okay? So he came on foot. And a lot of us may be here today because James Elkins didn't have a horse, okay? It's odd how that type of stuff happens. But he did get there in time. The battle had just ended. He guarded the British soldiers that they had took prisoner. And then, his Revolutionary War service had ended at that point. This map shows all the places that are mentioned, not all the places, but many of the places that are mentioned in his Revolutionary War pension. This amazed me when I plotted all this out. Look, I've not been to some of these places myself, and you can jump in your car and drive on the interstate and be there in a few hours, right? But he was doing this either by walking or sometimes by horseback, and sometimes he was in a boat going down the Tennessee River, okay? But these are all the different places that he mentioned in his Revolutionary War pension, places that he had been to, places where he had served, maybe guarded a fort. And in Tennessee there, you'll see what is modern-day Chattanooga, Tennessee. There was a Cherokee village there, and that was one of the places that they had descended the Tennessee River in boats and went down and in a preemptive strike where the Cherokee were allied with the British. They were fighting during that time, and they went down and actually destroyed some of the Indian villages and the crops and things like that. So a lot of history involved in his service. Now, when he got out of the war in 1780, then he went back home to the Clinch River. And you can see here, this is the original marriage record. Down about 3/4 of the way down, you see where James Elkins, and it says Maddie Jackson, and Maddie would have been a nickname for Martha. But they were married in 1782. You'll notice the minister's name, Simon Cockrell. He was a regular Baptist minister. Simon Cockrell, if you know any of the Cockrells here in Estill County, I'm almost certain that they are descended from him. Now, the Bible. These Bible records were fairly common for that day. Not a lot of them have survived, of course, but you didn't have birth certificates. You didn't have a way to record things like that. There was no civil authority to record that stuff. So many families put it in their family Bible, and this is actually his actual family Bible pages. They're right now at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And I will tell you that I wanted the color scans, and you see I got them, okay? But I want to tell you that I requested them online, and I got a letter back saying they were too fragile, they wouldn't do it, okay? But somehow I had accidentally requested the same thing through a different branch. And they went and straight got them and scanned them for them and sent them to me. So anyway, perseverance praise God. But they wrote down their birthdays. James Elkins and Martha Jackson wrote down their birthdays. You can see he was born in 1755. She was born in 1765. It lists all their children, their 12 children when they were born. And the other pages list their marriages and their deaths too. Now, the first time I find the Elkins family moving to Kentucky was in 1790. And so they had left the Clinch River in Virginia, and they came through the Cumberland Gap. And the first time I find them in Kentucky is 1790. And it's in this Howard Creek Baptist Church record book, okay? And you can see there where they were joined by experience, okay? That meant that they had a born-again experience. This is the actual church that they joined in 1790. It's sometimes called the Old Stone Church. It's the one that's on the back of the book. This church is still standing, okay? I've actually been to a service in it in Clark County. If you ever want to go, that they're still having services. And this is actually the oldest church west of the Appalachian Mountains that's been in continuous use throughout its history. It was constituted in 1781, and they built this building, the stone building, probably around 1790, and it was a congregation of separate Baptists, okay, and they one of the interesting things when you look at their record book, the leaders of the church were of course European, white, but many of them owned slaves. And one of the remarkable things to me was that they let the slaves be members too. And I think that's a very important first step in people recognizing that black people have souls and they're human just like us. It was a very important step. And what happened after the Civil War, the congregation decided to go up on the ridge up on Boonesboro Road. If you go between Boonesboro and Winchester today, that new road that's up on the hill, well, there was an older road that was one time the new road. And so they decided to go up there and build a new church. Well, the black members of the church asked to stay in this old building, and they were needed and granted it. And so it has continued throughout to modern day as a black congregation. And I went there and visited one time, and they asked me to stand up and introduce myself, and I told them I was a Baptist preacher, and the pastor said, well, brother, get right on up here, and he had me lead in prayer, and it was a wonderful service, and I just really enjoyed it. And if you ever want to go and see something very historic that a lot of people don't know about, that's right here in our community, you should go see it. This is 1798 title bond. This is kind of like, almost like a mortgage. before someone deeded you a property, land, if you still owed the money for it, a title bond was issued. And that title bond, once you paid all the money, then they would actually turn around and write you a deed for it. Okay? So this title bond is from 1798, and James Elkins was buying land from William Bush. Now that's Captain Billy Bush. That's the Bush settlement. If you're going between Boonesboro and Winchester again, that was called the Bush Colony. Okay? There was about 6,000 acres of land that was took up there by Captain Billy Bush that he sold to fellow members of his church, that stone church that we looked at. Okay? And Captain Billy Bush was someone who actually was one of the original axemen for Daniel Boone when he carved Boone's trace through the wilderness to Fort Boonesboro. Now, 1802, the North District Association, you heard me talking about the regular Baptist and the separate Baptist, okay? They decided they were going to unite, okay? And so they did. In 1801, they came to terms of union, okay? And they said the regular Baptist and the separate Baptist, they were going to drop those names. And they were going to be henceforth known as United Baptists, okay? Now, I've been a Baptist all my life, right? And I remember there's my grandparents were primitive Baptists, and we were missionary Baptists, and then I'd see United Baptists, and I'd see all these names, and I didn't know what they all meant, But as I started studying this history, then it started unraveling, and you could see where it started regular and separate, and then when they agreed to unite, they were called United Baptists, okay? And so whenever they united in 1801, Baptists like to associate with other like Baptist churches, so they created a new North District Association. And so what you find here is this is the original record book that was kept from 1802, and it was handwritten by a man named James French, and he was the secretary or clerk for the association. And so he handwrote these records. He had been at Fort Boonesboro. He was there during the siege of Boonesboro in the Daniel Boone days. But you can look down through there and you can see the various churches that were part of the association. And if you look on this bottom left of that first page, you'll see Upper Howard's Creek, and you'll see James Elkins' name there. And by this time he had left the Stone Church as Native American raids and maybe danger eased up, then people started going out into the countryside more, away from Fort Boonesboro. And what you see is as they went away, then they had a need to establish churches closer to the community where they lived instead of traveling so far. And so this Upper Harris Creek Church had gotten permission from the Old Stone Church to create a new congregation, and they got the blessing for it. And James Elkins was a member of that. You'll notice our station camp is a member. There's other early churches with ties to Essex County, like Red River there, that's known today as Salem, which was the oldest church in Essex County. Going forward to 1810, I've just got some records here I want to show you. This is a road order. Back then, these primitive roads that were being built throughout the county, you had to, if you lived along that and you were an adult male, you were required by the court to work on the road a certain amount of time every month. Okay? And so these road orders were kept, and they said who lived along that road and how many people in their house were required to work on it. About halfway down the page, you'll see James Elkins. He was required to work on it. This road today, if you've ever been out Kentucky 89 going toward Winchester, this is about the community of Ruckersville as you drive through there. You can see his son-in-law, Brandon Richardson. The Richardsons from Estill County, that's where they come from. Now, as James Elkins moved a little further away from Fort Boonesboro, he ended up owning 3 different tracts of land in Clark County. His last stop was where Lovegrove Creek enters into the Red River. That's the end of Lily's Ferry Road. Okay, there's a Lily's Ferry Road on the Clark County side. There's a Lily's Ferry Road on the Estill County side. Well, those once connected, of course, at a ferry run by the Lilly family. And so James Elkins bought the farm where Lovegrove Creek enters the Red River and where Lily's Ferry came across back in that day. And so he eventually moved his membership to Log Lake Baptist Church, which was constituted in 1804. And you'll see there in 1820 where they were accepted as members. They had moved their letter from Upper Irish Creek to Log Lake. Now, there's no Log Lake Baptist today, okay? We'll get into that in a minute, but there is a Log Lake Christian Church. This is from 1828. The North District Association, these old Baptist associations, every year when they had their annual meeting, they would print a record of their meeting. And I know we did that years ago at the Jackson County Baptist Association at Drip Rock. And Pine Hill, I remember that when I was a kid. And so this is a printing from 1828. And I want to point out, if you look, James Elkins is listed as a messenger from Log Lick. But if you look just above that, at a church called Grassy Lick, which was in Montgomery County, you'll see the name John Smith, okay? And John Smith had been a regular Baptist, okay? And he had a tragedy in his life. His wife and young children, while he was away, their house had burned. And his wife and his young children had died in the house fire, okay? Now, regular Baptists, today we might call them somewhat a primitive Baptist. And Bobby Wayne and I know about primitive Baptists, okay? And our family was primitive Baptist. We're not, but a lot of our family was, okay? But those primitive Baptists had this idea of predestination, okay? And I'm not here to argue religion. I'm just trying to explain how we got to where we're at, okay, with different churches. And so the regular Baptists believed in predestination. So part of that was that you were foreordained before the foundations of the world to be saved or lost. It was not your choice. You had no free will, okay? So John Smith struggled with that because his little babies, his little children that had burned up in that fire. With that belief, they might not have went to heaven, okay? With that belief, they might have went to hell, okay? And that really bothered him, as it would have me, okay? And so it made him start questioning that predestination, okay? And so what you find is that the old regular Baptists were big on predestination, okay? The separate Baptists were about free will, okay? They united, but what you find is that union started to disintegrate because they couldn't get beyond that religious difference. And so this 1828 record shows that John Smith was there. Now, he's sometimes called Raccoon John Smith, okay? And he was a very influential Baptist preacher, okay? And what happened, he started listening and learning from a man named Alexander Campbell, okay? And Alexander Campbell was questioning a lot of Baptist doctrine, okay? And what you find here is the North District Association was basically being torn apart by what some term a Reformation, okay? And I bring all this about because it's so interesting to me. But this is when the Church of Christ, the Christian Church, the Disciples of Christ, this is when much of it split off locally from the Baptist Church. And John Smith was a very influential preacher. And in fact, when the North District Association was divided over this, by far the majority of the churches became Christian churches, Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ. And so you heard me say Log Lick Baptist Church is not there anymore. Okay? Log Lick Christian Church is there. Okay? After the division, what would happen is those two different congregations would share that building. They both felt like they had a right to it, okay? And they would share that building, okay? And maybe the Baptists met on the first Sunday of the month. And the Church of Christ met on the third Sunday of the month. And then they shared the cost of upkeep. Eventually, the Log Lick Baptist Church died out, okay? They had been kind of a primitive Baptist. That's what they eventually developed into, okay? Those separate Baptist churches that believed in free will eventually left this North District Association and went to the Boones Creek Association, which is still alive today. You know, a lot of those missionary-minded churches. Baptist churches are still alive. But that also happened here in Estill County. Station Camp Christian Church today, it started out as Station Camp Baptist Church, but there was a division about this time in 1828. And you'll find that the Baptist church that was more of a primitive Baptist eventually died out. You know, my grandparents were primitive Baptists, and it's a very strict doctrine, isn't it, by the way. And so for the most part, they're dying out around here. I don't tell you any of that to say one is right and the other one's wrong. Okay, I'm just telling you why this history, how it transpired. James Elkins died in 1836. This is the sale bill of his estate. You can look down through there. This is the actual handwritten record that was sent into the court. And you can look down through there and you can find family members, neighbors that were buying different pieces of furniture and farming utensils and livestock and whoever wrote this out spelled phonetically. Okay, because one of my favorite parts is the part where Robert Crow on the left-hand side, about halfway down, he brought 5 cheers, you know, and that's exactly how we would say it today, right? But now, 1959, Dad's sister, Hannah Miller Stamper, an article was written about her research and what eventually became the Lexington Herald Leader. Back then, it was the Lexington Leader. But this is a picture of James Elkins' tombstone. She had went and found it in the 1950s where he was buried, and the story was written as a result of that. And then she went later to take someone to see it, and the person who owned the land did not want a cemetery there, and unfortunately has happened to many, a lot of our old cemeteries. They had went in and took something and pushed the headstones out and destroyed the cemetery and pushed them over into the river is what it was told. And so anyway, you know, that was part of my research, has been trying to relocate where he was buried. And I did find it. I did find this court case from 1884. Basically what it was, his son James Elkins Jr. had bought out the heirs of the farm and combined it with his land that joined it. And so this is James Elkins, the Revolutionary War soldier's grandchildren, dividing up that farm in 1884. And I chose this as the cover of the book. You can see there it labels Lovagud Creek where it goes into the Red River. That's why I can go today and show you exactly where this farm was at. You can see how the different grandchildren are divided up by lot. And you'll notice even the Village Ferry Road is noted there. And if you notice where it says a white oak, which is kind of a corner for the road, when I first found this out, I went and that white oak was still standing. It was a huge old white oak. The top was broken out. But Lovagud Creek, you know, Daniel Boone named Lovagud Creek, and they were camping in 1769 on the Red River, and they had been at night around the campfire reading a copy of Gulliver's Travels. And in Gulliver's Travels, there's a place called Lovagud, and so that night, as everybody returned back to the campfire, one of the other hunters named Alexander Neely had killed 2 buffalo that day at a lick, a salt lick. And he said that they had fought like Lilliputians, or whatever that term was in that book. And so they named that Lovagud after Gulliver's Travels. Okay? And to me, that's been part of the neat part of this journey, is finding out the root of all these names, place names that we have today. Here's a modern day aerial photography of the farm, and the yellow arrow points to where James Elkins Cemetery is today. I would like to someday put a headstone there. It's currently, of course, private land, and I've talked with the landowner, and you know, I can understand why they wouldn't want a headstone right in the middle of their pasture field. You know, they had no idea there was a cemetery there. You know, they were not the owners who destroyed it. But I would like to continue to work on that. The blue area is marking where the old house was. The purple one is marking where another son had a house, and the green one the green arrow is pointing toward a newer cemetery that's still really old, where the younger Elkins family is buried, and they have headstones, and that cemetery is in pretty good shape. Now, that's kind of James Elkins. I'm going to try to go a little faster. I know I've been a little slower, but part of why I wrote this was family history, right? And I've collected a lot of pictures, scanned them from my grandmother and other people that I would go and see. And these old pictures are just, I think they're really neat. This is my third great-grandfather. His name was James Elkins Barnes. And if you ever wonder where Barnes Mountain got its name, this is where he got his name. They were the first settlers there. This man was born in 1819. He enlisted in the Civil War. He volunteered for the Civil War. And he was 40-something years old when he volunteered. You know, you think a lot of times of young men volunteering, and they did. But he was in his 40s with a wife and several children when he volunteered, okay, for the 8th Kentucky Infantry. He actually was in several battles, several really big battles. Stones River was one that he was actually injured at. And he was later captured in Dalton, Georgia, okay? That was before all the carpet factory was there, I think. But, so he spent about 6 months in Andersonville Prison. If you've ever heard of that, it's a Civil War prison by the South where they kept northern soldiers that had been captured. And it was intended for about 12,000 people, 12,000 prisoners. They ended up having 30 to 40,000 there. And if you've ever read the history of it, there was a little branch that come through the middle of the stockade, and that branch served as their water supply and where their latrines were built. Okay? So you can imagine the filthy conditions that they were exposed to. Okay? And one of the things while he was at the Civil War, one of the funny things that's come down through my grandmother, she said while he was away at the Civil War fighting, that his wife and children were back home here in Estill County. And that said that Grandpa Barnes played the fiddle. Okay? And so in the middle of the night, they heard this noise coming from the yard up on Station Camp. And they heard the strange noise, and the mother woke up all the children and said, "Oh no, that's your daddy." I can hear my mother saying this probably. That's your daddy's ghost. He's been killed, and he's out in the yard right now playing the fiddle. Okay? And scared the children to death, you know. And they finally got the nerve to go out and see what it was. And it was an old goose running her bill up and down a piece of tin, okay? And evidently he wasn't a good fiddle player. This is his wife, Mary Jane Elkins Barnes, and you know, I love these old pictures. You can see this one has been wet. It was no doubt got water damage. This is John Shep Crow. I know there's several of our family members here that's descended from our Granny Miller. And this is Granny Miller's grandpa, Crow. And he was a Civil War veteran too, fought for the North. And he was in the 14th Kentucky Cavalry. And he is buried over on Clear Creek, P Ridge today. P Ridge today. Yeah.
Harvey Road.
Exactly. And but what you find is that 7 of those Elkins children moved to Estill County, and most of them settled on Clear Creek. And as you drive on Richmond Road back into Irving, when you got that beautiful view of the mountains in front of you, to the right, that valley is Clear Creek, right? And that they own from there, where you first start over the hill there, where you're seeing the mountains in the distance, all the way up to Stacy Lane today. And so there was hundreds of acres in there that the Elkins family had settled on in the early 1800s. Now, this is Jakey's great-great-grandfather, I think. Great-great, yeah. His name was Absalom Richardson. The Richardsons from Barnes Mountain, okay, Brushy Mountain. Granny Richardson Springs. Granny Richardson Springs was named after James Elkins' daughter. Her name was Martha Elkins, and she married Bradley Richardson. And they owned the land where Granny Richardson Springs School was at. Okay? Now, she was long dead before the schoolhouse was built. But the schoolhouse was named after her springs where she went and got water. Okay? This is one of her sons, Absalom Richardson. He fought in the Civil War. He's in the 8th Kentucky Infantry. He was in the Battle of Stones River. He got shot in the leg at Stones River, and he was evacuated, took back eventually to Nashville, and then on back to Louisville, and stayed in the hospital there. He was in the Invalid Corps, as they called it, because he had been damaged or injured. And my understanding, Jack, you tell me if I'm wrong, but his hair looks really dark there, but it was red.
Red.
Okay, so being red-headed is kind of an Elkins trait. Zachariah Fielding Elkins, he lived in Clark County, but eventually went on to Lexington. You can go and visit his house today in Lexington; it's still there. But he was a well-to-do businessman. His son even became the postmaster for the city of Lexington, and so that part of the family was certainly very successful. This is another one of Jakey's ancestors, her great-great-grandmother, I think. Great. Okay. Ruth Barnes Fox. So the Fox is from Barnes Mountain. This is kind of the progenitor of that, and she was a daughter of William Barnes and Jane Elkins. The Fox is from Drip Rock.
She was also a sister of James.
Exactly,
Yeah.
she was a sister of James Barnes. So
Yeah.
Jakey and I are related like 500 ways. William Perry Elkin, another. You can see how old that is. That's a tintype. That's probably from the 1860s or 1870s, and it's just really unusual to find photos that old. This is another aunt. Her name was Levisa, and she was married, I think, 3 times. Her husband would die, and she would remarry. But one of the interesting things that's come down, and I think it was her, Grandma Flynn was talking about. But last week you all had the story about Edward Hawkins, okay? Dickie Arthur, I think, was talking about Edward Hawkins. He was called Ned, okay? And he was a scoundrel. Ned Hawkins was a scoundrel. And he was eventually hung for all these murders and things that he had committed here in Essex County. But Grandma Flynn said that one of her grandma's aunts, and I think it was this one, okay? And by the way, if anybody knew Barbara Hunt, this was her grandmother, great-grandmother. And but one of Grandma Flynn's great aunts was at the hanging when Ned Hawkins was hung, okay? And the story goes that Ned Hawkins was evidently a very handsome man, okay? And this aunt had said that it was a shame that they had hung such a good-looking man, and she had to live with such an ugly one. So, I think she kind of wanted to switch him out, maybe. But, to me, that's what makes these stories come alive, when you can put that, Grandma Flynn, if you ever knew Grandma Flynn, she was a storyteller. She had a great memory. All of her stories had come from her grandparents who were alive during the Civil War, and she was just a treasure trove of stories and information. Getting into the great-grandchildren, this was Bradley Richardson's granddaughter, Granny Richardson's granddaughter, Nancy Margaret Richardson Gabbard. She lived to be well into her late 80s, early 90s. My mother, who is sitting here, my mom, Vernita Flynn Miller, Mom is 88. And Mom, you remember your Grandma Gabbard very well, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah. And Mom was probably 20-something years old when her great-grandma Gabbard died. And so you see we're not that far removed, really, because Mom would hear stories from her great-grandma Gabbard that she had heard from Granny Richardson, who was James Elkins' daughter. So you can see that tie that binds families down through the generations. This was Grandma Flynn's grandmother, King, and she was a character. She was a storyteller. Aubrey's got her whiskey jug, okay, but she was a storyteller, okay. Medicine, okay, yeah. I've had Grandma Flynn's coffee. But Grandma King, evidently, she was a big storyteller, and it sounded like she exaggerated just a little bit to me, okay? But anyway, she told about a tornado that hit near her home one day, okay, back in the 1880s. And she said this tornado, she said there was a fence post. She stood and watched it out the window, and there's a fence post that went around her house 7 times. Okay? And somebody said, well, you know, Grandma King, how do you know it was the same fence post? You know, she said it had a knot in it. I mean, she must have had incredible eyesight. But there again, if you were a relative of Randy Miller, Bobby Wayne is a relative here. This is Bobby Wayne's grandparents.
Well, that's my daddy in there too.
That's your daddy. That's Bobby Wayne's daddy and his grandparents. It also happens to be my dad's grandparents and uncle. And Jonah Jesse Crow. And this is a different Jesse Crow than the one that was hung last week. Okay? But Jonah Jesse Crow, their old log house is still standing up on Doe Creek. And that log house is, you know, well over 125 years old. And but, you know, I love those old pictures. Great-great-grandchildren. I will tell you, my grandma Flynn is the little girl sitting on her mommy's lap. That's Mom's mother. That's Mom's grandparents. And I could be here the rest of the evening telling you stories on them, but I won't do it right now, okay? But I just want to show you the link back through time and how a lot of these stories I put them into the book. Now, this is Mom's, there again. You see the two little twins up front. Many of you knew my Aunt Martha Flynn Morris, Aunt Martha as we called her. And then that's her twin brother, my grandpa Wesley Flynn. He's wearing a dress, but that's what they did back in those days, okay? And so that's Mom's dad and Mom's grandparents there. And they own that little country store that was in Wagersville. That's still standing in my life. And then coming on down, that's my grandparents, Debbie's grandparents, Ruthie's, Aubrey's, Jimmy's. I don't know, I'm forgetting somebody else, sorry if I am. But that's our grandparents, Jim and Eddie Miller. It's my dad in between. But, you know, Granny Miller, you know, she was from the same family. And that's how I'm related to them on both sides, Mom and Dad. But one thing about this photo was that they already had this was a studio photo, and they had it scheduled already to take it in 1944. Okay? And the day before they went to take the photo, they got a telegram saying that their son had been killed in World War II. Okay? And so Angus told me that explains why Granny Miller has such a solemn look on her face in this photo. She had just found out the day before about her son's death. So, you know, I don't mean to be a downer, but that stuff, it matters, people. You know, it matters. You know, we have freedom today because people paid their life for our freedom. And I think that's very important. Coming on down to me, my 3 sons, Benjamin sitting over there on his iPad or my phone one. Because, you know, he says he'll never read the copy of the book that I gave him. Now, so I've talked a lot, and I want to ask if you have any questions first.
Surprised you still talk.
I don't mind if you got questions. If you're afraid to speak up, that's all right. You know, I do appreciate you all coming. I appreciate your time. I want to thank the staff and volunteers of Essex County Public Library. Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate you setting this up and hosting it. And also the Essex County Historical and Geological Society. And Yvonne is here today representing them. And she's going to be available. The book has been sold through the Essex County Historical and Geological Society. And you have, if you want a book, and there's no pressure for me to buy a book, okay? I'm not a salesman. But if you would want a book, I will be going over here in a minute. If you want me to sign your copy or something like that, I'll be glad.
I was just going to say thank you very, very much for the work that you have done and for the time you've taken to talk to us. We thank you for your generosity of donating the proceeds of your book to us. The Estill County Historical and Genealogical Museum is located on 133, just down the road a little ways. We're open every Saturday from 10 to 4. So if you want to do research or if you want to look at things or you just want to come hang out, please come and join us. If you hear of somebody that wanted one of these books that didn't get a copy, please send them to us. We can we can hook them up. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank y'all, I appreciate it. I'm gonna go over here, if anybody needs me to sign the book, I will, okay?
Oh, thank you.